Hey class, welcome back. We are talking about the Middle Ages still today. We talked about the overview today. We were talking about the feudal system, and it was their form of government, and their form of society for that matter. Uh, you had a hierarchy that took place with the feudal system, and it was kind of similar to the Mesopotamians as they built communities around one city, and had walls and everything. But with the feudal system, you had a hierarchy. It started with the king. The king owned everything. Okay, he owned every single piece of thing, but he couldn't rule all that by himself. So what he would do, he would spread it out amongst people. He'd give it to land to your barons and your nobles, and then they would give land. They'd break up that land into the lords, and all of it was done for service. All right, because he'd give them that land, but then the king would give them land, but then he would expect like soldiers, or he would expect money in return, taxes, if you didn't have an army to help uh, give to him. So that's how the medieval feudal system worked. All right, and it goes all the way down to the peasants. The peasants were the most common people in the feudal system. They had the most of those, and they were very poor. And we'll talk more about them in just a few minutes. But that's how the feudal system worked, or their government worked. All right, and like I said, the basic government in society during the Middle Ages was called the feudal system. The Lord owned the land and everything in it. All right, the Lord was given the land by the king. He owned all the land in it, everything in it, and he'd keep the peasants safe. And in return for their service, the Lord in return would provide the king with soldiers or taxes.
Feudal system overview. The basic government and society in Europe during the Middle Ages was based around the feudal system. Small communities were formed around a local lord and the manor. The lord owned the land and everything in it. He would keep the peasants safe in return for their service, and the lord in return would provide the king with soldiers or taxes.
So, under the feudal system, land was granted to people for their service. If you look here, here's kind of a layout of it. The king owned everything. He'd give land to the barons, all right, and the barons in return will give him money and knights. The barons would divvy out that land that the king gave them to knights and to the peasants, all right, and they would provide different services. The knights would provide military service to the barons. The barons would provide those military service to the king. Down here, the villains, or the peasants, would provide food and service when demanded, all right, for them to stay on that land. So it was kind of a big cycle that they went through.
Service for land. Under the feudal system, land was granted to people for service. It started at the top with the king granting his land to a baron for soldiers, all the way down to a peasant getting land to grow crops.
All right. At the center of everything in this feudal system was the manor. Okay, and that's this. It's usually a castle or something. All right. It was run by the local lord. The local lord had been granted land from the king. All right. And everything would sprout up around that. Everything would sprout up. You'd have your church down there. You'd have your community down there, your workshop, your water mill, everything. Farms would spread out, and they'd be worked by the peasants. So the center of life for the feudal system was the manor.
The manor. The center of life in the Middle Ages was the manor. The manor was run by the local lord. He lived in a large house or castle where people would gather for celebrations or for protection if they were attacked. A small village would form around the castle, which would include the local church. Farms would then spread out from there, which would be worked by the peasants.
And remember, in Mesopotamia, how they would have the walls. They'd have their city, and they'd have the walls, and they'd have all the crops outside the walls. It was kind of similar to that. All right, they would all work the farm out here, but then when somebody would attack, they would go inside the castle for protection. So, all right, so the medieval feudal hierarchy. At the very top was the king, this guy right here, the king wearing the crown. The king couldn't control all that land by himself, so what he wanted to do, he divided it up among barons. So in return, the barons pledged their loyalty and soldiers to the king, and so that's how how it first started up. Then they would divvy out land and they would expect services too, the barons would. So they would break up the land that the king gave them. So when a king died, though, his firstborn son would inherit the throne. And if they stayed in power for a long time, it was called a dynasty.
Hierarchy of rulers. King. The top leader in the land was the king. The king could not control all of the land by himself, so he divided it up among the barons. In return, the barons pledged their loyalty and soldiers to the king. When a king died, his firstborn son would inherit the throne. When one family stayed in power for a long time, this was called a dynasty.
All right. Then you had the bishop over here. The bishop was the top guy in the church. Well, the church was very powerful at the time, the Catholic Church, especially during the Middle Ages. And it made the bishop really powerful as well. And a lot of times they weren't just powerful, they were rich too, because everybody in the land paid a 10% tithe to the church. So this made, the bishops very rich. And I always tell y'all, it's always about money. Everything in history is all about money. Well, the Catholic Church, the bishops, then, it was all about money for them too.
Bishop. The bishop was a top church leader in the kingdom and managed an area called a diocese. The Catholic Church was very powerful in most parts of medieval Europe, and this made the bishop very powerful as well. Not only that, but the church received a tithe of 10% from all people. This made some bishops very rich.
All right, then you had your barons and your nobles, all right? And the barons and nobles, they would rule large areas of land called fiefs. All right, it was called fiefs, and they reported directly to the king. And what they would do, the king would give them land, and then they would divide up the land that the king gave them into other chunks. And they maintained an army for the king, basically. And if they didn't have an army, sometimes they would pay the king a tax, and this tax was called shield money.
Barons and nobles. Barons and nobles. The barons and high-ranking nobles ruled large areas of land called fiefs. They reported directly to the king and were very powerful. They divided up their land among lords who ran individual manors. Their job was to maintain an army that was at the king's service. If they did not have an army, sometimes they would pay the king a tax instead, and this tax was called shield money.
All right. So the barons divided up the land that the king gave them into they divided up among lords and knights. And in return, the lords, they ran these local manors, and they would also send these knights to fight for the king if asked. All right. The barons basically owned these knights. And the lords owned everything on the land, including peasants, crops, and the village.
Lords and knights. Lords and knights. The lords ran the local manors. They were also the king's knights and could be called into battle at any moment for their baron. The lords owned everything on their land, including the peasants, crops, and village.
All right. Now let's get to the most common people during the Middle Ages. The most common people, and most of the people living in the Middle Ages, were peasants. That means they were very poor. All right. They had a rough life. They worked 6 days a week. They didn't own anything themselves usually. All right, some did, and they were considered free, and they could own little businesses. But most of the time, they were kind of like slaves. All right, they owned nothing, and they would pledge to the local lord. And like I said, they worked long days, and a lot of times they just barely had enough food to survive.
Peasants and serfs. Most of the people living in the Middle Ages were peasants. They had a hard, rough life. Some peasants were considered free and could own their own businesses like carpenters, bakers, and blacksmiths. Others were more like slaves. They owned nothing and were pledged to their local lord. They worked long days, 6 days a week, and often barely had enough food to survive.
All right. So who was the top leader in the land with the feudal system? Was it A, the bishop, B, the king, or C, peasants? It was B, the king. He owned everything, and he wound up divvying up his land because he couldn't control everything at one time by himself to barons. And the barons would then in return divvy up what land he gave to lords. And all this was in service for the king. All right. He was granted land for service.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, number 2. What building was the center of daily life in the feudal system? Was it A, the manor, B, the school, or C, the cabin? It was A, the manor. Everything, the lords on the manor after the nobles or after the barons had given them land, and everything sprouted up around this manor. All the whole community did, and if they needed protection, they went inside the walls, kind of similar to Mesopotamia. So the manor was the center of daily life for the feudal system.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 3, who owned everything in the village, including the crops, town, and peasants? Was it A, the bishop, B, nobody, or C, lords? C, the lords owned everything in the village, including town and peasants. They were the ones that owned the manor, okay? After they had been given this land by the barons, all right? And so they owned everything in that. They owned the manor, they owned the whole surrounding community.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, who reported to the king and owned large areas of land called fiefs? Was it A, barons, B, lords, or C, peasants? It was A, the barons. Barons were first granted the land by the king, and then the barons divvied up that land amongst lords. So, and they were called fiefs. Okay, the large areas of land were called fiefs from the barons. The barons that were given to the barons by the king.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And our last one, who was the leader of the Catholic Church in a kingdom? Was it A, the king, B, bishops, or C, barons? It was B, the bishops. The bishops were usually very powerful because the Catholic Church was very powerful, and a lot of times they were rich as well because everyone paid a 10% tithe to the church out of their own pockets. So a lot of times they were not only powerful, but they also had a lot of money.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class, that's going to do it. Be sure you go on Schoology, read through the lesson, all right, answer the questions, and submit it so you get credit for everything. And I will see you next time with Charlemagne. You all have a good day.